Hello, guys. I hope everyone is having a really good day or night wherever you are. It's time to talk about the could've, should've, would've. Some people would say this is part of the fog, the fear, obligation, or guilt. Maybe it is for someone who's being abused. Basically, this is what leads us into illusions. And for someone who is in abusive relationships, this could've, should've, and would've can lead us into like toxic hope and either thinking we could have done something different or wishing that the other person would have done something different and living maybe in this endless cycle of trying to make it right, going back, trying to make it better. And there's so many different versions of this, not just for the abused person, but other ways this can show up that I want to cover. But basically, it's what we get into a lot of times with the problems with images and idols and illusions. And so hopefully this can be very clarifying and help us walk out of traps. I've also entitled this video Weeping for Tammuz, and I will get into that in a bit of what that all means if you've not heard of that. But it's easy for us to get caught up into the could've, would've, should've. Sometimes it's because we've been lied to so much and all of the gaslighting and the lies that happen in abusive relationship. That's easy to do, but it's also easy to do because of the heart issues in a very sick, messed up world these days, and our heart wants things to be right, but they're just not right. The people aren't right, people aren't acting right. We've oftentimes been raised up in very evil systems where things aren't right. Sometimes on this channel I refer to the verse of the foundations have been destroyed, and so that leaves us with very little options and difficult, extreme circumstances, and thankfully the time is actually short in the end times, that it won't be that way for very much longer. That's my encouragement and hope that I would like to share. But there is this issue of the heart being very easily deceived. One way that I see that is that the heart does not have the eyes, maybe as quickly and very well connected as the brain does. So our heart a lot of times does not have the full information unless we give it to the heart, which I'll get into. But the heart is more easily deceived because of emotions and feelings. A lot of times, like for women, this can be a situation that I've gotten into before of the commandment or the edict that was passed on to the women that your desire will basically be unto the husband or to that man situation. And I think that really plays with women's hearts a lot. And so it's good to recognize that so that you know that's what's happening, and maybe you can separate from it if it's leading you into something evil. Because a lot of times there's a lot of things like that that can catch our heart away and lead it astray of your desire being in the wrong place, very strong desires that women have that people don't understand. Even other women won't understand, I don't think, until they know this principle that that woman is so smart. Why is she falling for something so stupid? It may be this principle of the desire being very strongly linked to what is supposed to be that husband figure, which does not really exist these days, at least not in purity, wholeness, uprightness. You very rarely see. But not just picking on the guys, I would say it would for the girls too, but there's not a scripture that says that guys have a desire toward the women in this particular way. And I believe this also shows up in diagnostic statistics in a certain way for women. But that being said, our heart can be easily deceived and tricked for so many different reasons of being kind of led astray. One of those reasons is in our culture, and you could call it marketing, you could call it the prince and power of the air, or this battle that we're in, this spiritual warfare, that the systems around us are pumping and pushing evil into us at every opportunity through media and entertainment and social and peer pressure. And so our heart can be deceived if we're following all of this, and that's the only window we give our heart and our interface in life. We don't give it anything to do with a very strong influence of the words of God and the truth of God and the Spirit of God and hearing and listening to Jesus. That's very important. That's why it's so important to get saved and walk with the Lord and to allow Him to be our Lord, is so that our heart can be changed and not be easily deceived. It's also why you renew your mind with the words of God, so that that can be another influence into your heart. It should be a very strong influence into your heart. So there's a difference there, though, between your mind and your heart that's very important. A good study of the Psalms may help you understand this as far as recognizing of why you're being led astray even when you know better. That's also why it's important to do things like circumcise the fleshly heart. It is okay and it's important to cut those things away and to give them to the Lord, to bring it to the cross and leave it behind because it's not good anymore. It's not benefiting you. It's not spiritually correct. And it can lead you very far astray into very damaging, difficult situations, and possibly even to spiritual damnation. All the worldly influences that say follow your heart, trust your heart, those are lies. That's not the way it should be. We need to actually put guards and filters, and be diligent, be sober. And a lot of times, like I said, we're being lied to. We can't just follow our heart. That's like a marketing campaign of follow your heart, and then all of the influences around you are telling you to spend your time and your money and your energy, and that's not necessarily the truth. And this is just kind of like a description of how you can fall into could've, would'ves, and should'ves easier. That are illusions. They're not the truth. Especially whenever, this is one of the trickiest things I'm going to try so hard to explain in this video. Especially when you're given a lie, a traumatic lie. Whenever a person is given a traumatic lie or a sob story, that is whenever it is the easiest to fool the person. You could say love bombing would do like the same thing, so that's kind of like the opposite. It's not a trauma. It's more like a drunkenness. So there is the concept of being drunken and being led astray there, but there's also this trauma that can happen, and that's why I'm naming this the weeping for Tammuz. Is a lot of times when we're given a trauma and we're told this story, we go with the story because our heart, our blind heart, is already engaged, and we're just led completely all the way there. Like if you saw someone who was in trouble or in need, and you're given this story about their life and things they've been through, you're more likely to just believe it with no questions, without even a thought of that could be the wrong answer, unless you're an exceptionally skeptical or jaded person who just doubts everything and criticizes everything. If you're just going about your daily business and you're rather innocent in life, and not blaming people for becoming very skeptical if they have been really messed with a lot, but for the typical innocent type person, whenever they hear a story and there's sadness to it, or difficulty or hardship, they will automatically believe the lie. This is why a lot of people automatically believe the smear campaigns. That's the part of the story that is manipulated by someone who is like more pathological, will deliberately make these heart-tugging stories up of how they were wrong so that the person will just automatically believe it. So that's something very careful to watch out for. A lot of times whenever I'm wrestling in my own mind with abuse concepts and how to immediately jump from one point to another in points that have kind of been blocked up, if you guys know what I mean, whenever you're thinking. And I've heard Dana Morningstar, for example, call things like thought holes instead of potholes, where your mind will get stuck. And so I try to come up with a way to quickly have that reference, and usually I'll put a word to it so that I can just immediately go there and be able to process it. And so whenever I come to this concept that I'm talking about of having this illusion that immediately takes your heart astray into a falsehood, I call that like a 9/11 strategy. Or I think of 9/11 and I'm immediately there and I immediately understand it. And what I mean by that is I believe what happened on that day is very horrible, terrible, criminal, awful, sad, tragic things happened that day. But people were told a complete lie about what really happened. However, since what happened was so tragic and terrible, everyone immediately and instantly and completely, just about everyone, completely bought the lie. Of course, it was on a big scale too, so that helped sell the lie. But everyone not only immediately bought the lie, but they passionately bought the lie. And that's a really good example of your heart being completely led astray and you being just led by the nose, completely believing the story of whatever you're told. because it was such a tragic and terrible situation. And it's still difficult for me to put into a concept, but I've seen people make this decision so many times. One of the better ways, I guess, to describe it is, since it was so horrible, it must be true. Since it's so terrible, that validates the situation. It must be true. For example, if you had like an old schoolmate that was a really good um, young man or woman back in high school, and they helped everyone out, they never fell into trouble, they made good grades, and they were somebody that took care of things and never caused any kind of trouble or problem, and they seemed like a nice person every time you had anything to do with them. But then maybe you lost touch of them for about 10 years, and then you hear from someone that you don't really know that well, but you don't know good or bad about this person, but you guys all went to school together. And if they tell you something like, oh, well, this person, they got really caught up into drugs and now they're homeless on the street out at such and such city, most people would instantly believe it, because in their heart it's such a horrible predicament. And there, of course, there's also the concept of who would lie about something like that. You know, you're thinking, I would never I would never make something up like that. That would be just, there would be no reason to make up things this horrible. So maybe that's part of what leads the person's heart astray, is they're thinking there's no reason on earth to invent these horrible things, like saying that someone had cancer, or saying that they got caught up on drugs, or caught up on one thing or another and they're homeless out at such and so. And before you know it, since it's such a terrible story, is what I'm trying to say, since it's such a tragic and terrible story, you instantly believe it. You're instantly like, well, that must be true. And maybe that's a lot of it, is you can't imagine someone lying about something like that. So maybe because you would never lie about something like that. And so there would be no reason for anyone to make up a story like this. But I think that's what I'm trying to say about these situations, is that if it's overwhelming and drastic enough and also tragic enough, we tend to instantly not only believe it, but we tend to defend it very strongly, and to believe it all the way, and to have a lot of passion about it. And that explains why a lot of people, I believe, get so political about certain things, is they're caught somewhere into a tragedy. They believe that tragedy. They believe they're standing up for this right, or this abused person, or that harmed person or group of people. And so, not realizing how much money and power goes into things like that, they don't realize maybe how much they've been misled. And so that's why a lot of times when someone's heart is really into something and into the story, that they instantly believe it, they completely believe it, there's no critical thought involved, and then when someone comes along from the completely different perspective, people can very passionately defend their stance, because there has been this initial, very strong, very complete belief and acceptance, complete acceptance. And I believe this is the principle of why people, every time I see this now, I equate it to things like the 9/11 lies, and I also equate it to this idea that's seen in the Bible of weeping for Tammuz, which was a form of idolatry that apparently some of the women got caught up into. And it goes on to describe the idolatry of both men and women, things they were caught up into. But the women were caught up into this idolatry of weeping for Tammuz so strongly that they were literally crying tears. And I'm going to explain the story of what was going on there to the best that we know of. That happened so long ago and was described very briefly, but we can know some things about this Tammuz figure. And the reason I want to use it is that this is typical idolatry. It is verbatim idolatry with this idol of Tammuz. And it also gets into a lot of the heart issues that people have with an idol, including the could've, would've, should've illusions, including getting carried away in your heart over things that were never true in the first place and never happened. And also the fact that this Tammuz figure is a legend or a myth. No one could ever prove that this person ever lived or existed, that it was never a reality. And yet people were crying tears and getting so caught up emotionally. So something happened there where people were blindly following after an illusion very strongly. I think that's the point I'm trying to make here. When you blindly follow an illusion so strong in your feelings that you can't let it go, and you do things like waste time and effort and follow after an idol and follow after illusions, and it keeps you from following after God and knowing the truth and being free. Because you're so caught up in something that's fake and false, you cannot be free. And that's not how God wants us. That's like in the verse that Jesus said, you will know the truth and it will make you free. A lot of people say it will set you free, but it says it will make you free. And this can be a process that takes a little while. But another thing, though, like I said before, is being raised up in a world full of electronics and entertainment, which involves marketing, which involves coming after not only your money but also your soul, that you're trained from a very young age by the world systems. You would be anyway, even without electronics, but it could be worse with electronics. We're trained from a very early age to follow after things with our whole heart, when the Bible says to follow after God with our whole heart. But to automatically, without maybe even knowing fully what we're doing, we just give ourselves over with our whole heart to a great variety of things that are not even true. And that's a catchphrase that I want to use as I'm describing this process, guys. Things that never happened. That's one of my pet peeves. Getting so caught up and emotional, in love with, grieving after things that never happened. And the reason I want you to know this so strongly is it's making you weak and it's making you sick. And it's one more way that you really need to be stronger, is you shouldn't ever be emotionally caught up of things that never existed or things that never happened. And so to further describe this process with Tammuz, supposedly most people think that this was like a god of vegetation. And I'm going to read a little bit here from this website of grahamhancock.com. This article that was done here, that's grahamhancock.com. And this article was called Freemasonry, the Broken Column and Weeping for Tammuz. And it's from the website of Graham Hancock, whoever this is, but it was a good description. I read through several of them, and this was like one of the best, I believe. Apparently in Freemasonry they have a broken pillar, a broken column, and there's several ways that this Tammuz character comes through, by the way. All down through time, you guys, if you studied anything about mythology, you understand that sometimes a god will have a different name depending on what culture, or a goddess will have a different name depending on what culture you're coming from. And so that's the same for Freemasonry. They have like a little different representation, but it really means the same thing. And he's trying to say that this broken column symbol for Freemasons is the same thing as the god of Tammuz, because it's such a known thing in mythology. But in here he's describing that Tammuz, the theory here, since there's still a month that's named after Tammuz whenever the weather starts failing, is that Tammuz is over crops. So anytime you can imagine in the past, whenever they have had a god or a goddess that had anything to do with the food, that became a very important thing. And of course that called for a lot of like worship and even sacrificing people at times to try to get the food and the crops to be okay. So maybe this is why Tammuz became such an important figure, that we have heard about it. But something happened, and different stories maybe tell the different effect. But Tammuz, I also think it's funny that people wept for Tammuz in the different stories. Sisters wept for him. I think a wife wept for him, and a mother wept for him. But the funny thing in these stories is how rude and arrogant and selfish and cold he was toward these people, and yet they still wept for him. And they even offered to take his place, like in the underworld. You know, they would give him anything, but he was just cold and hardcore, and that may be kind of like an interesting example of like the psychopathic abuser, who it's all about them and that's all they can see, and yet these women are just given everything. The women are caught up in their heart in some kind of a trap where they constantly have to give to this idol or this god figure. So I thought that nobody really talked about that when they told the stories of Tammuz, but I was like, this is funny. I've seen this before. But in the different versions of Tammuz, he's over the vegetation. And so if you weep for Tammuz, like half of the time Tammuz would be in the upper world, and the other half of the time he would be in the underworld or something, to where while he's in the underworld you have to weep for him and cry. And he goes away and like into death, but then he resurrects and comes back. And I really should do a video about the false gods who mocked the Trinity and mocked the resurrection unto life, because some people say, well, that's proof that Jesus was just invented out of older cultures and older stories. But I think, of course, number one, these older cultures were following patterns of nature that tell the gospel story. And number two, the enemy was behind these demonic influences. The enemy knew a lot of the gospel and what was coming. And so he, of course, would sow confusion and give several stories down through history of trinities and virgin births, just to confuse people about the true gospel, or to try to. So there's different reasons why that could have happened, but the idea is here that whenever the growing seasons go away, if you offer these sacrifices to Tammuz, such as weeping and mourning, and your heart being broken, that ensured a better crop. Whenever he came back later, he would give a good crop. But it's interesting because so many times, just like it always was in idolatry, it wasn't just the sacrifice of weeping, it was often these very sexual sacrifices, the prostitution and the just horribly immoral things that are not worth mentioning that people would do. And it's very typical with idolatry. That's a really good sign that there is an idolatry. Like if you're having a relationship issue and it has to be immoral, there's idolatry involved. And it's something that is not good. It's something where you're probably getting caught up in your heart, being led away from the truth. Your emotions are being taken hostage. You're not being treated right, and you deserve to be free of that and to be able to get away from it. But it's just interesting. This is an example of Tammuz's mother was like your typical god that was seen through so many names, all down through lots of different cultures, such as the Isis, the Semiramis. There's a lot here. I'm just going to read some of the ones that may be a little bit more recognizable that we know of. There's Kali, Hera, Juno, Maria, Mary, Virgo, Diana, Venus, Ishtar, Lilith, Madonna, Artemis, Ashtoreth, Aphrodite, Persephone. I don't think I'm saying that right. The widow, because the widow was also one of the reasons why it was such a grievous thing, of her only son Tammuz, which the Freemasons refer a lot to the widow's son, which they call Hiram Abiff. And so Hiram Abiff would be another name for Tammuz, but that's a huge thing in Freemasonry. But the widow concept also would give you a virgin birth, that she is a virgin and she gives birth to Tammuz. There's the Black Virgin, Our Dear Lady, the Scarlet Woman, the Weeping Virgin. That's why you really should not trust these statues and these paintings that are weeping. That's all demonic. The Lady of the Lake, the Queen of Heaven, the Queen of the Sea, the Wife of Baal, Queen of the World, and Queen of the Underworld in Mystery Babylon. And that's why I say anything like this Mary and the Mary and the Virgin and the Whore of Babylon, it all goes back to Babylon. This is all the same concepts. But of course the prostitution that's involved. Another name for Tammuz would be like Nimrod. I think there's a lot of different names and representations of this Tammuz through time, through different cultures. And so in this article that I'm referring to, it gets into a lot of like the Freemason rituals and their direct relation back to these Babylonian things, which they're calling by a different name. They talk about Hiram being the widow's son, and I've heard about that so much, and you guys may have also. And they have these little sayings like, will you help the widow's son? And it's supposed to be code words. And Hiram Abiff was supposedly helped build this temple of Solomon. A lot of this is blaspheming the things of God in the Bible too. But in the actual verse in the Bible comes from Ezekiel. Whenever Ezekiel's being shown the different pagan influences that are actually coming right into the people of God and the temple of God. And it's quoting here from Ezekiel, I think, chapter 8. It says, "Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. it would be really interesting to have a lot of good detail on how they did it and why, and how emotional. I mean, was this actually a demonic thing that people would get possessed? And I mean, there's descriptions of people going into a lot of prostitution, and that probably is a lot of possession and a lot of demonic influence with it. Anything that's idolatrous like that, you're going to have these demon spirits that are seriously influencing people. I do believe that. It gives a reference here from the Bible Explained. There's references to the death and resurrection of Tammuz, and there's rites and rituals in the Freemason tradition where when you're raised up to the third degree and things like that, that you're ritualistically killed and then raised up. And I did talk to one Freemason who said that that was actually the most spiritual experience he ever had. So it's not like these people are just going through the motions. Some of them are, but back when I read about that a lot, I would hear that people would say that you would more likely to have a spiritual experience if you're already doing spiritual exercises. I think that would mean when you're already opening yourself up to the spirit world, which this guy was very much into all of that, that of course you're going to have like this demonic enlightenment of some form. That would not surprise me. But he was like very impressed at how wonderful it was for him. So this isn't just like games that people play, not for all of them. And even the ones who think they are playing a game, I would say they're in danger. There's this tradition of a death and resurrection, which they're mocking Christ. And I'm saying that, hold on to that idea for a minute. But from this article that I'm referring to, they give some reference to the Bible Explained. Instead of weeping for the national sins, these women wept for the idol. Tammuz, which is Syrian for Adonis, the paramour of Venus. It was an annual feast that was celebrated to him in June, like I'm saying, when the weather starts changing, or the idea of the weather will fall from then forward. Syrian women in wild grief tore off their hair and yielded their persons to prostitution, concentrating the hire of their infamy to Venus. These have always been known as like perversions and crazy rituals anytime you hear about it. But when you hear about these wild rituals that people get into, and sometimes they can be extremely lewd and explicit, and even like one of the names here was Janus, and that reminded me of the crew of Janus when people are celebrating in Mardi Gras, and they're of course taking off their clothes, and that's part of the fun or whatever, and it's all devil worship of one degree or other. Of course, when your culture gets so filled with devil worship like ours is, people say that's innocent, whatever, you're making a big deal of nothing. But it's because we have been so seeped in evil for so long that the people that are grown people standing in your face telling you that you're making a big deal of nothing, you have to go back to when they were babies and when their parents were babies being raised up in a culture seeped in evil. You've got to see way deeper than this person in front of you mocking you. They are very far off course, and it's okay for you to be different than that. It's actually desperately needful that you be very different than that, even if they never understand. It's like your salvation should never be anywhere near in their hands. But they're talking about, for different reasons in different countries, other periods have been devoted to commemorate the death and reviving of the Babylonian god. And they're referring to a specific month usually, and there was idolatry involved, different names that Tammuz went by. It's related to this Janus. And the reason I'm going through this is we see it. You'll see this even in ways that you won't believe, in things that are kind of hidden occult and hidden idolatries. Like, I always refer back to the standard pagan idolatrous mythology of our times would be like your Marvel superheroes, Star Wars and Star Trek, and others that would be similar to that. And I'm most familiar with Star Wars and Star Trek because that's what usually came on any television programs that I was around. I'm not so familiar with the Marvel superheroes. Some of you guys may be, and you guys may know of a death and resurrection of a halfling or a half god, which I would say like Spider-Man would be half god, half man when it comes to the symbology of worshiping this idol. Things like this. But like in your Star Wars, the biggest way you saw this, it's so interesting how it's put in there, and I'm not sure how deliberate, or I'm sure it was deliberate spiritually. But your half god, half man person would have been the Darth Vader character, who I believe was originally Anakin Skywalker. If you remember, he was born out of basically nothing but a desert woman. You know, the virgin birth, the widow's son. And they had this fancy idea that they finally turned into a story of Emperor Palpatine was manipulating the Force and caused this one that was prophesied to bring balance in the Force or something like this. And so he was born of a virgin, you could say, and or at least it was like the Immaculate Birth. And of course, as you go down through his life story, there's like a series of deaths and resurrections. And at one time was when Anakin dies and Darth Vader is resurrected. Another time is when Darth Vader dies and Anakin is resurrected back. Anakin dies and is resurrected into like a light force hero. So that's a really complicated plot line, but it follows because he was always the hero of those stories. Darth Vader was like a fundamental fulcrum crux of the hero of the stories. And people say, yeah, Darth Vader, the dark evil lord, but he wasn't like a hero. He was like the villain, but it was like the hero of the story because there was so-called salvation in him, that came back to the light, or he brought balance to the Force. That would be a good way to say it because that's how the movies say it. He so-called brought balance back to the Force, and he was the prophesied one. So he would be like the Jesus figure that they are mocking. And I do believe there is a lot of spiritual power in these rituals of these movies they do. That's why people get caught up into it in their mind, and they live in those worlds. There might be one in the Harry Potter world that's similar, but I think that may be a little different. I don't think that's your fundamental mythology. I think that's just a witchcraft lore for little children. But in Star Trek, the figure would have been Spock because he's half demon or half Vulcan and half human. Well, of course, according to mythology, that's a half god and half human, and they always make out like he has these godlike spiritual powers in all of the little shows. And so that would be your God figure that dies and is resurrected. And I'm not really sure about like the Immaculate Birth or the birth of the widow as much as, of course, it was a human woman. So it's kind of hinted at there, but it's hinted at more as though he's half God or half demon and half man. And that's the mockery of Jesus. And later on in the movies, and this is where I absolutely, my eyes were completely open to there is something really deep behind these wicked movies. That Spock dies this death. And this is where they just went full on idolatry and just really, for lack of a better word, stupid with it. That Spock dies, and he's dying in some kind of a chamber, I believe it was, and Kirk could not get to him, and they were always buddies. That's another thing. They make him out. You talk about catching people's heart into the story. From the beginning, they were catching people's heart up into the story that he always wanted to express his emotions, but he never could. And they were catching people's heart up into the story that he was something very different because of his humanity, but he could never express it, and he could never show it, and he could never be what he really was, and everything had to be all full of angst and weeping for Tammuz because he could not fully express himself. And I think there's always an element to this. And there may have been some element of that for Darth Vader because he was terribly scarred and deformed, and he could not walk around as a free person. He had to be always trapped under this black outfit, and nobody could actually see his real heart and who he really was. And you notice whenever they were finally redeeming him, they pulled the mask off. But he always had to have this mask, and he had to be horribly burned and scarred and chopped into pieces and weeping for Tammuz of his sad, difficult predicament. And he wanted to come to the light, and he wanted to love his son and his daughter, but he couldn't. They try to catch people's hearts up in these false dilemmas, guys, of things that never existed and things that never happened. And I'm kind of going into detail with you guys because back to the idea of how blind the heart is, people will watch a movie and they'll instantly be in that movie like it's just as real as the world that God created. And these things never existed and they never happened. However, some people have the theory that these are plays, even back to the mythology stories and characters. These are plays that are based on things possibly that happen in the spirit world. And we're given these heart tugging little phrases like at the beginning of the movie, long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, and you're immediately like, oh, it was so long and far away, I'm weeping for Tammuz. Immediately your heart's caught up, right? And you're like, oh, the story, I wish I could have been there, and I wish those characters were real and I could have seen them. And, I'm not sure, each person probably gets caught up into it to a different degree, but that's what I'm trying to warn. These stories that never happened and never existed, we don't even need to go there in our heart and our mind if it's consecrated to God, because we might be going into something that's spiritual, that maybe a version of that did happen in the spirit world at one time, or maybe there's something going on in the spirit world that it's trying to catch us into, but it's definitely, if nothing else, catching you into something that never happened and never existed. But it's training your heart and mind to react as though it did. It's training you to be emotionally captivated, emotionally captured into something that never happened. And possibly you could be a lot more easily mind controlled in that way. But to finish the story on what happens with Spock, and everybody's like all heart filled over him because he wants to be human and express himself, but he never can. And this is awful and sad, and the weeping, the tears for Tammuz. And that's what makes people maybe get captivated into a story like that never happened. So he's dying, and Captain Kirk is there reassuring him, and he dies. So they put his body into one of the space capsules and launch it out to space, as in the honor and the funeral. And I believe what happens is his body lands on a planet that's going through a genesis, what they're calling a genesis process, and I don't remember details, but it's something like this. Whether or not it was a experiment that was being done by a certain group, or whether that was just a natural thing that was happening. I think it was an experiment where they did some sort of a genesis experiment on an entire planet. Well, it just so happened that Spock's body lands on this planet. So of course when the experiment hits this planet, it goes through a genesis process where it's like an experiment to try to revive these dead planets or something and bring them back into a complete life, back to everything in these shows is very demonic, and training people that we eventually, if we just evolve ourselves enough, we can be our own gods to the level that we can create like God if we just get the right handle on technology. Just lies, complete deception about God's capability versus man. And so they do the genesis process on this planet, and Spock is raised back to life. I believe that's how it went, but that's just where it went so completely off the rails into idolatry and mocking Jesus Christ, the death and resurrection of Jesus, that I had to completely turn my back on ever even entertaining anything like Star Wars ever again, because that's where it went so off the rails into, from maybe an innocent soap opera that I thought was innocent, to this is now full-blown mocking Jesus and the Lord. And deliberately and stupidly, like seriously challenging anyone's intelligence. Very wrong. But these are just some good examples, even like into the modern day myths and the modern day idolatries of weeping for Tammuz. They always try to pull your heart into it. That's part of why I think there's not a clear story on Tammuz. It was probably just whatever version would get people emotionally caught up enough to do things like be in grief, unnecessary, prolonged grief over something that never existed and never happened, captivating people, captivating their heart and mind, to either be caught up in grief or lust, or both. And so I think that those are huge components of classic idolatry: grief, emotions, things that never happened and never existed, and lust. So if you guys see that happening like in a relationship, there you go. That's what you're dealing with. And that's why I'm calling this an illusion, and this weeping for Tammuz principle of idolatry, of when your heart's being deceived and led astray into something that never happened and never existed. You're being told a lie, you're being deceived, it's not even real. And how to be free, to be careful of ways that you're being trained and tricked to follow your feelings instead of knowing what's true and right. And that's part of what I'm kind of going toward in my channel, of where I believe in the times we're in, it's so much more important to really just start weeding out extra entertainment. We really, really, if you're a true Christian who is truly following God and truly getting ready for Him to come back, we don't have any place for entertainment, like the worldly entertainment and music. Like the TV shows and the music are huge. Not only do we not have time for it, but we don't have enough time for the things of God. We don't have enough time between all the burdens that are going to be put on us and how short the time is that we have to get ready. We have no time to witness, to warn people, any of it, let alone having time. If you're being entertained by some TV show or some music, or letting your spirit get caught up with the wrong kind of music and all of that, that is completely the backward opposite. I'm not trying to be nitpicky with rules and too perfect and all of this, as much as I'm trying to explain clearly the difference, because I've lived both ways. I've given my testimony before of, like, whenever the Holy Ghost came over me the first time really strong, and I depended on things like television and things like worldly music to help me emotionally survive in a very difficult climate for a young person in the world, because I had no clue about the Holy Ghost at all to help me by. But after the Holy Ghost first came over me, I just knew I had to get rid of all my music and I had to stop watching TV. I absolutely knew that that was pathways to hell. And since then, thank God, by His grace, I have not had those influences in my life. That's part of where I come from when I'm explaining this, is I've lived both ways and I know the difference. It wasn't just that I was raised strict and I decided to stay that way and put my head in the sand and not know anything, but I know the difference of whenever you set a lot of your life apart to God and dedicate to Him, and not just in music and entertainment, but that's just the bare bones basic. I mean, that's, if you're living for God, you do not have those things around you, or you're really just double and wavering, and you're a lot more captivated than you may realize. You may have a lot more emotional problems and immaturity and enslavement problems, where you're enslaved to other people in your life than you ever realize, because you're giving yourself over regularly to these influences. And in a lot of cases, people are blind. I can see a lot of people that go to church and even lead in church, and the women that lead in the music, but then they go and they play their country music all week and go to the football games. I can see, I can so clearly see that they are not with God like they think they are. It's just the way it is. And so hopefully that was helpful. I mean for that to be very helpful. If you're seriously struggling with something, for that to be a little tip of, hey, just try something. Maybe you won't be perfect at it at first, but when you start cutting things out and truly dedicating to God, you'll get your power back and realize things maybe you lost or didn't even know that you're supposed to have. But I have to say these things because the time is super short. We're in a whole different time than people think we're in. If you want protection and the evil that's coming, and of course, if you want to be ready in any way for what's coming, I have to say these things. These are the bare bones basic. It's not even being legalistic. It's not being Puritan. It's not going too far. This is the bare bones basic. I think a lot of times the weeping for Tammuz idea will explain a lot of what people call liberal logic, of people that are making their decisions based on, you're like, what did you make that decision based on? You're so convinced. You're so completely convinced and sold out and sure of yourself, and you can't even you don't have any kind of evidence or proof. And whenever I do bring a lot of proof to the contrary and a lot of evidence and facts, you don't want to hear it. You don't want to hear it at all. It's because it seems like there's entire groups of people who believe, it's in their faith system somehow, in their belief system, that it's perfectly acceptable to make your own decision based upon your own ideas, and there is no outward truth in reality. And it's perfectly okay that just because your very blind heart that we're talking about, your very deceived, blind heart, gets caught up in the feeling super hard, this feeling, like I said, of things that never happened and never existed, but you feel so passionate about it. That's all that matters. And they're making their decision based on that, and that's it, and that's enough, and it's plenty. And if you come with any other sort of logic different than that, it's completely unacceptable. It's really hard to put some of these things into words because it can be very foreign to us, but I believe that's what's happening a lot of times with people that are making decisions that make no sense. But they're so passionate about it, they refuse to budge or change. Of course, I think a lot of them are embarrassed once they're confronted with reality. That's where the extreme defensiveness comes in, very defensive. And I would be impressed if any of them at least went back in private and was shocked and said, I've never heard it that way before, but wow, these people make a lot of sense. Wow, and I really wished I was that way. And maybe I need to look into something they're talking about. That would impress me. That would impress me because it makes me wonder if these people have the decisions that we've talked about that somebody can make, the very like inner vow type decisions they can make to start grasping a lot of control over their life, or a lot of I'm going to put myself first, I'm going to hurt other people and not care. It be extremely selfish or even be extremely wicked. When people start deciding to break away from reality, that that's something that they absolutely have to do to survive or to get over abuse, or to just choose wickedness because they have a very strong lust for wickedness and a desire to do things that are arrogant and selfish and wicked, and they decide, I'm just not going to care. Maybe that's what you're dealing with a lot whenever you see somebody who is following a very blind, deceived heart. And a lot of times I go to the most extreme example that would be an atheist who decided to be an atheist on purpose to hate God, and therefore they get very defensive when you bring up God. But if they're that kind of an atheist, that would be like the extreme example that would help you see it maybe in lesser cases in other people. They decide a long time ago. They may not even remember completely the decision they made. All they know now, years and years later, is from a very blind and deceived place. Years and years later, from a very blind and deceived place, they become very defensive and even angry that you seem so right when they know they're right. And so maybe that's what you're dealing with there, but I believe these are these heart issues where trying to spell out the clarity of having a very blind and deceived heart and the difference between living in that place on purpose versus recognizing that, according to the words of God, this is something that happens. We can have a very blind and deceived heart, and there's remedies for it, like bringing it to the cross, accepting that God is higher and His truth is more and important and better, and we should always try to accept God's truth first and question our heart every time that can be very deceitful and wicked. To be willing to question our heart and to give it to God, to give evil things to God and say my heart was wrong, and to completely, to regularly renew ourselves with the truths of God to help our heart not be so deceived and blind in the first place. It could be so important of having your roots in reality so that whenever the Tammuz comes along, you can very clearly see, well, that never happened. That's like some people never get caught up in soap operas. They never get caught up in fantasies and movies, at least not as much. It's like they, like I've complained about some narcissists. One of the signs of some narcissists is they own a set of a movie series. Like for one person who told me about their narcissist person, it was the Godfather movies. They own it and they play it all the time because in their deceived, blind heart, Godfather is real. It existed and it happened. And I'm trying to say it never existed and it never happened. And so you can easily see through these fantasies and the future faking and the when a person is caught up in their own blind heart, you can see through it and say, nope, boy, they seem very sure and they seem very convinced. And it never existed and it never happened. Their love bombing never existed and never happened. And that part can be a process. When you live through it and you believed it, it will be your own individual process of coming out. Some people say grieving the loss of a person that never existed, of acceptance and saying even everything was a lie. It never truly existed. It never truly happened. But what's great is when you have the truth and you have the truth of God, there is this automatic, wonderful replacement of, that never existed and that never happened, but God always did. That's one more reason why it's so important to have your really, as strong as you can, constant relationship with the real God. Is you can always say, well, at least, it's hard to look back on a decade or more of your life and say, wow, that never happened. That was all a lie. But if there's parts of it, like for some people it's their children or whatever, where they could say, you know what, that wasn't a lie. That part wasn't a lie. Or maybe even some people say, my true feelings in the my love that I had to offer was not a lie. So anything like that that you can use to say that was not a lie, but I love to have my relationship with God and the Lord and say that was not a lie. Jesus was always faithful and true and still is and will be from here on. That's not a lie. That's a very strong thing I love about a good way to overcome this. One of the things that can happen in this could have, should have, would have illusion, it's not just with movies and soap operas. And the reason I'm using this, the reason I'm starting this introduction with the ancient idolatry and how we can see it in modern day idolatry and fantasy is to help you understand how we're being trained to still be under these bondages. But also, there's like entire life processes, especially as things are failing around us, where we get caught up in lots of different kinds of illusions of the could have, should have, would have. This is how things could have went or should have went. Spock should have been able to show his emotions. Darth Vader should have been able to come out from under his mask and love his son. The things that will pull at your emotions really strong and hard. That's a silly example, but I'm giving the backdrop. There's so many things in the real world, and especially when you're meeting these abusers, that's what happens a whole lot when we're trying to make a relationship with the abuser. We're caught up into, but it should be this different way. So my argument here is that's another version of weeping for Tammuz, is when you're caught up in, but it should have been this way. It could have been this way. And a lot of times a person will beat themselves up and they'll say, if I would have just been more beautiful or handsome or strong, if I would have just been able to deal with it more, if I would have been more mature, if I would have made more money and had a different house and a car, and on and on and on and on and on. If I had a different family background, or it's all about me not being legitimate enough, me not being perfect enough. And if I would have just been more godly, if righteous or obedient or, lots of different versions of it. If I would have just been more, could have, would have, should have, if I would have done better. But a lot of times our falsehood is caught up with if the other person, because that's the truth. And despite our abuse and our different forms of gaslighting, a lot of us can see through it, and we're sitting there saying very truthfully, if the other person would have ever grown up, if they would have actually seen who I really was and respected me and treated me right, and if they would have been adult and mature and secure and had peace and not constantly trying to show off and not constantly trying to be all this and that and running after other people and respecting and loving everybody but me, that kind of thing. And that's true. If those other person would have been a completely different person, and if these other people would have been what they should have been, just even close to what they should have been, things would have been very different. That's true. If the culture would have been different, if the world would have been better, if the world would have been more Christian, you would have had better opportunities. And this is not just in relationship. This can be with job situations, financial status. If I wouldn't have got cancer, if the world would have been a healthier place where I wouldn't have gotten so sick, and I lost over a decade of my life to that sickness, I could have been in a different place. I could have been out of debt by now. And so people can get really caught up in these could have, would have, should have, and it catches their hearts and the emotions for so long. And it can kind of be like a slap in the face when you're in these situations and people be like, well, just count your blessings. You're not being grateful enough, because there are grievous things and there is a such thing as grieving. And you are right that you should have been at a different place, but you weren't given the best chance. And that's true to a degree. But what I'm talking about is when the could have, should have, would have get you up into bitterness and entitlement, and now you're ready to stab everybody in the back to get what's yours because you were cut off, or you're willing to not be the right thing and not grow the right way and not be grateful and not be humble, because you get so caught up in the bitterness and the wrong of the way that it could have been, it should have been, or it would have been, because you were cheated, you were wronged, you weren't given what was yours. So many different unhealthy versions of this and unhealthy traps of I'm owed now. I'm so owed, and I'm so much better than this, and I've given so much. I've given so much. This is another reason why it's important to be a Christian. Because if you have given so much, and you truly have, and a lot of people have, Every bit of that is written in the books. And when the Bible talks about laying up your treasures in heaven, that's what you're doing. So if you're like, well, I've given so much and I should have XYZ, well, you probably do have that and a whole lot more in heaven. Your treasures being in heaven, and it's not just pie in the sky talk. When you have that heart to heart relationship with Jesus, you can feel these things. It's true. And that's just one more reason why it's so important to be Christian. That helps you get out of entitlement and bitterness and arrogance with these things. Another way that this can happen, though, when it's in like in a relationship or anywhere else, is that you can have toxic hope. That this is what happens a lot that we talk about on here with the narcissism, is when a person in their own free will is choosing a lot of evil, and you keep thinking it's almost what it should be. It's almost there. If they just are a little bit more mature, and if they just learn not to do this behavior or that behavior, in other words, miracles that you're wishing for these people, and you have no control because you're not the one that's doing the things they do in their own free will. But that's that area of toxic hope, of I'm just going to keep staying here. Some people call it throwing good money after bad money. You've already given so much, you might as well give a little more to see if it'll ever work out. But this toxic hope of it's almost how it should be, so I'm just going to stick around and hopefully, they'll finally wake up and appreciate me and all of this. But that's just some of the traps that this can lead to whenever your heart's being captivated and it's not the truth. And it's not following the truth. But a really big part of this is the bitterness and the entitlement traps that can happen here. And this can show up in so many different ways, where, like the discussion that we're having with Anne Barnhart and her diabolical narcissism, of the trap of being abused by a diabolical narcissist is becoming one yourself. And this is one of the ways it can happen. It's because we have all these legit needs that are never met. And so we can be tempted to become very bitter and arrogant and entitled and ungrateful, and therefore start just making up our own ideas, not following God, do whatever we want to do and feel like in the situation because we're owed, because we're bigger than this and we're better than this, and why not, and things aren't right anyway, so I'm going to sit here. And the other thing that happens, the reason why this turns into bitterness and entitlement, is whenever we need and our toxic hope of things could have, should have, would have, we will try really hard to make it that way. Like with the relationship that's not working, we'll stick around and we'll try. We'll be so determined that we almost got there that we're going to make it that way. No matter what, we're going to make it the right way, right? And some people do their children like this too, and it's awful. And this goes back to having an idol. Whenever you have this perfectionist illusion and this perfection idea, on one hand, you can have legitimate expectations out of life that are never met. Like you have a legitimate expectation to be healthy and to be able to walk around and not have to catch your breath. But you may have unfortunately some disease process that you never asked for, and so you are out of breath or severely short of breath. It's just one example. So it would be a reasonable expectation of yours that you would love to be able to walk around and breathe without having to catch your breath, for example. That's reasonable. There's a lot of examples like that. But some people develop this idol, and they start setting up an idol, and I believe it becomes like Tammuz, and it captivates the heart and leads people astray. Where, for example, with your child, and your child may be, maybe they look different and they act different and they interact very differently than was your ideal way that you would have wanted a very good child to be, especially like for a narcissistic person. They want an ideal mini-me, and so they'll do these abusive things like punish the child unnecessarily when they're not an idol, make unreasonable demands and expectations on the child, and then over glorify and praise them when they do meet the expectations. And so they put all this pressure on the child to be something. I'm sure we've all seen these examples, sadly, but it's an idol and it's an image, and that you can do this in a lot of different relationship ways, that you're setting up this expectation that's not real, and it's never going to be real. Even if it looks like it is, it's never going to be real. And the sad part is, like this narcissist wanting their child to be this ideal mini-me, they'll look at the neighbor's child or somebody else's child and say, that's that child. That's what I want my child to be like. And that's super abusive, terribly abusive to somebody. This goes back to having these superficial expectations and demanding on people and being so hateful to a person when really you can have richness and good, respectful things with the person, within understandable limits. You could have really good things with the person if you just cared for them, like your typical narcissist abuse situation. But instead, it's got to be all these unreasonable expectations of some idol, some perfect idol that doesn't exist and never did. And so, setting up these idols and saying, well, I never got this, and I'm bitter, and I'm entitled, and life owes me, and it should have been perfect like this. So, when they see something or they see someone or a thing in the world and they say, that is the perfect thing, that's the perfect car, that's the car I should have had, that's the house I should have had, and it's not right, and life owes me, and that was mine, and I should have had it. And so that's where, if it's a person, it can be so extremely abusive, because it's like, I've heard of stories where someone's spouse came home to them in private and said, I want you I want you to start dressing like this, and I want you to do your hair like that. And it didn't take long for the spouse to catch on that they were talking about someone that they saw regularly in public. This person wanted their spouse to start dressing like this other person they saw in public. And that's why I'm talking about these idols of, if only you were like this. And I know I'm accepting of preferring a style, preferring to a certain degree, to a certain healthy degree, preferring a certain style and asking the person you're with to if it didn't hurt them too bad, would they mind this style or that. There's a certain degree of that that's acceptable. But I'm talking about having the idol so strong in your mind that you come home and you say, I don't want to be with my spouse, I want to be with that other person. And so I'm going to demand of my spouse that they work really hard to be so much like this other person that I can imagine that I'm with that other person while I'm with my spouse. And these twisted, wicked things like that. And it's back to this tricky concept of, I have this perfect idol, and that's the way I want things to be, and which, by the way, doesn't exist. Even if there's a person right in front of them that they think is that idol and the way it should be, that person would never be that anyway. That person's going to change, they're going to grow. That's why the idealization stage happens with a narcissist. They idealize it, they idolize it. Whenever they first meet you, they idealize you, and a lot of times they try to groom you and make you into the idol. But over time, any idol, any perfect standard, oh, this is perfect and it's finally here, and I'm entitled and I'm bitter and I'm arrogant, it's going to be my way and I deserve it, and I've done so much and I'm so special, and it's going to be like I want it to be. And they idealize you, and of course they're love bombing, because something in you was like, that's really close to my idol at first. Like I say, every person is never going to match their fantasy. You're never going to match their idol. Nobody will. And there will be a season when they first idealize someone that it seems like that person will. Just give it some time. Just give it some time, especially when the idolatry is at that level. There's going to be the massive devalue and the massive discard. Whether or not it happens as obviously, but that's a lot of what you're dealing with there, of relationships, and things could have been this way, they should have been this way, they would have been this way. It's all an illusion. When somebody's thinking that way, instead of thinking humbly and thinking gratefully and thinking realistically, they're thinking in an idolatrous manner, and it's extremely damaging, extremely unhealthy. The idols and the images that are set up aren't real. They're never going to be real. Back to, it never existed and it never happened. But when the devil gets someone's mind in this trap where they expect that idol, and it reminds me a whole lot of the guy who I've mentioned before, who does a lot of the therapy to try to help people overcome pornography addictions. And he says, I believe the way he says it is, it promises you everything, and it pretty much takes everything from you. It gives you nothing. And this is the same with any of these idols. And this idolatry process of expecting and demanding and thinking things have to be a superficial level of perfection instead of the deeper heart level of a true relationship is it promises you everything and it delivers nothing. If you never grow past that, if you stay narcissistic and shallow and idolatrous, you're going to be constantly provoked, constantly embittered, constantly shallow and arrogant, and you're going to be like led to a false expectation through this heart problem, led to false expectations, and you'll never get anything. You'll never have anything but spiritual death through idolatry. And even if it seems like you are having a lot robbed from you, because there can be legitimate hardships, there can be legitimate sicknesses, legitimately financial hardships, and you name it. That what people are missing whenever they're even led by things like that, well, I'm not following an idol. It's that I legitimately have a hardship. This is legitimately not here. The problems that that person is having is that they're not close enough to Jesus. Jesus is not real to them enough. They're not having a really strong, good relationship with Jesus, and they're not crucifying themselves. They don't know how. They're not being led to it properly. And this is like Christian principles of another reason why only the Christian ways work. But without these kind of ways, you will have bitterness, entitlement, and arrogance, and all sorts of idolatry and abuse. And addictions. It's usually an addiction process. A lot of times, too, that's part of, like I say, the 9/11 trauma, the 9/11 lie, is our enemy will bring a very strong robbery into our life or something, a very strong difficulty, especially in these times. And that's what I would say is only the power of God. It's only the power of God that can bring you out of that kind of difficulty and to see, to be able to overcome that. This is the whole thing. When you're reading in the words of God about overcoming and he that overcomes, this is a lot of what it's talking about, especially in our times. These are the things that we're having to overcome, that we're called to overcome. But the ones who choose idolatry and narcissism, they're not ever going to overcome. And my only passion for people like that is that they know that there's another way. If someone wants to choose that, they're being evil, and I have no I don't have a heart for that. I'm like, okay, you choose that, go ahead, because we all have choices. But whenever they weren't taught right, that's when I'll have more mercy and say, well, if they're just shown differently. But once they're shown differently and they just want to choose evil because they're bigger than God, they're better than God, and these people will be this way forever. God has helped show me this so I don't like weep for Tammuz whenever their soul is lost. That some people just choose this. They are very arrogant. They are so arrogant that it's mind blowing. And so that's what they want to choose. And if that's the way they are, that's between them and God. But they're not going to be very happy people, though. A lot of this has to do with these issues in our heart where, like God says, not to make a graven image, because images, archetypes, and symbols are so powerful for people, and they're so powerful for us. And that's where I go back to, we're in an electronic age, right? We're in an electronic age where our idols no longer have to be that we went into the woods and cut down a tree and we take part of the tree, as the Bible says, and burn it in the fire to keep us warm, but we take the other part of the tree and we carve little face out of it and we paint it and put jewelry on it or whatever to dress it up, and we talk to it, or we give it this great importance and meaning of our life and everything else that goes with that form of idolatry. We don't have to do that anymore for our visual image. Now we have the television screens and the images of our idols and our heroes and our gods. But it's still important to notice that we're still doing the same thing that we have this human weakness to do, or this human capacity or tendency to do. And so usually when somebody has this situation where they have a coulda, shoulda, woulda in their life that's never met, or they can't come to a process where they understand it and let it go of the heart issue of the weeping for Tammuz, and to say, that never existed. That was a vapor or an illusion. It was an illusion. It never happened and it never existed. And if they never come to that understanding, they start chasing after it really hard because it never realizes. It's kind of like the narcissist constantly idealizing something. They're trying to make something manifest that's never manifesting, because people are people. People are not objects. And that's why they'll chase after a partner and idealize them and then devalue them, is because the partner is not an object. And so what happens when they have the coulda, shoulda, woulda illusion is they'll chase after it so hard that they'll always be in search of a replacement or a suitable substitute in the real world around them. And that's part of why they future fake. That's part of why they one of the characteristics that we read about the abuser is they're constantly, as you guys probably very well know, constantly scanning the environment for prey, constantly scanning the environment for victims. And they may not even realize themselves that, oh yeah, I'm going to just really rip somebody open and bleed them out. No, they're not thinking like that. Some of them are. I'll give you that. Some of them are. But a lot of times they're doing this process of, I'm looking for the next person that I'm going to objectify. And they may not even realize that's what they're doing, but that's what they're doing. They're constantly scanning the environment for a victim. And of course, some people say they're constantly scanning the environment for a conquest of some kind, whether it's physical, emotional, or whatever. Constantly scanning the environment. And some people a little bit more constantly than others. But they're always trying to idealize, to find something that would fit that perfect, the perfect ideal. And it's even more powerful, the weeping for Tammuz level, whenever they feel like it's something that they're trying to rectify or straighten out or fix or correct, when only God can correct that and only truth can correct that. And the right, healthy things that God gives us. Like I said, no one will ever be able to perfectly feel that, but they believe. No one will ever be able to perfectly feel this place or this thing, but the narcissist believes that it's out there, right? It's mine, I demand it, it's out there. And that this is a reason too, though, why people will get caught up in rebound relationships. It's this same concept of when they're dumped and everything, they're trying to get back something that they perceive was lost, so they go into something very unhealthy. It's kind of the same thing happening there, sadly, but it's good. The reason I'm doing this video is so we can recognize these things and avoid them, hopefully, and understand where to go to get healing. But it's very strongly leading people astray into falseness and sickness and into abusing others. And like I said, the answer is really being close to the Lord for real and having your relationship first with Him. No one's going to be perfect at this, but guys, there is such a difference. Even having a vague concept of a relationship with God can help someone get out of this very quickly, much less having a very good, strong, close relationship with the Lord. So I'm not saying you have to be absolutely perfect. You know, it's all black or white. You're a complete failure. As much as I'm saying, this is where you go. You can grow out of this with the Lord. And all of the good, legitimate replacements that God has to offer, and also the cross of the words of God, describing of how to die to the lower parts of ourself and to our flesh, and we don't have to wallow and mourn and grieve and just dwell on how painful it's all gonna be, as much as this is giving us an option to have a very clean decision, a circumcision, a crucifixion, to have like a very clean process. When we really need the clean process, we can have a very clean, clear process of this has got to die. This has got to go so that we can have freedom and peace and things can be right again. And there will be some pain, but that's not what to dwell on. You know, that's not the thing to dwell on as much as to dwell on the freedom part and the good part that God offers. But there is the self and the flesh that will keep us from knowing good things, and it will keep us chasing idols that will perpetually never come true. Even though we can have really wonderful good things, that's the problem. That's the problem of like being spoiled versus learning to appreciate things the way that we should. It's always a problem, whether it's going to be in any area of your life. There's a spoiled version, and then there is a healthy peaceful version, a realistic version, and a God blessed version. Another way that I see this could have, would have, should have thing that is an illusion that aggravates me is whenever I see it in criticisms. And once more, I'm not talking about legitimate criticisms that need to be mourned properly and worked with God properly. These are like really petty, petty, petty things. And people making these blanket statements as though they had any choice about it in the first place, back to this illusion of something that never happened and never existed. People saying things about their own relationship or about other people's relationship that have no authority over that relationship at all, don't really have any business saying anything in the first place. But when people say things like, well, you should have done this, and it can be relationships, it can be financial decisions, life decisions, and I'm not talking about foolish, foolish decisions like you should have chosen when you were a teenager to not smoke. Okay, yeah, I agree with that. Like when you were 14, you thought you were so cute smoking with your buddies, and now you have a lung disease, and you've been wishing for the past 20 years you could put them things down and have more money and be able to breathe and not have an addiction. Okay, that's legitimate. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about these criticisms of, well, if you would have went back and done it differently. And what they're talking about is these little things that don't really matter, like you should have been a nurse instead of a respiratory therapist. You should have went back and went into this industry instead of that one. You should have went into banking instead of marketing. Well, you should have went back, and it's these petty nuance, doesn't really even matter. You should have went back and you should have bought a Ford instead of a Chevy. But they'll really like be in grief over it. And I don't mind people making petty little fun jokes. It's when somebody's in grief over it, like, I should have done this and I should have done that. Or a big one is things that you really have no control over. Like, I should have had a kid who does this and not that. I should have had a kid that was really good at soccer. I should have married a wife who doesn't snore. And dumb stuff. Like, if I had it to do over, I would marry a wife who doesn't snore. Well, you know what? You're going to marry the wife who doesn't snore, and she's going to be extremely rude to your friends or to anyone you meet in public and embarrass you constantly. Or from time to time, she will say something rude that you will have to somehow overcome. In other words, it's going to be either this or that in life. These expectations that things are going to always, it should have, could have, would have been perfect. These unrealistic expectations of, well, honey, you might have had a child who was good at soccer, but they would be terrible at math. Or, you might have had a child who didn't have this physical feature, but they would have had another one. So all of these foolish little, well, I should have had a child who did this, and I should have married someone who did that, or I should have, it's within reason. That's all I'm saying, is these things should be reasonable. I don't understand people who say, well, they're acting like, especially in these days where there aren't a lot of good selections of things, they're acting like the world is filled with such good, wonderful options. This is just back to kind of breaking some of these illusions, guys. Some people act like they truly believe that the world is so filled with such wonderful options. And I've heard this mostly with women talking about the men they marry. And I understand if you married an abuser or someone who's extremely filthy and vile and cheating and disrespectful and all sorts of things, yeah, that's wrong. But even then you can't say, well, I should have married someone who didn't do that. To me, what would be more realistic is, it's a shame there's no one left who doesn't do that. To me, even that's more realistic than, well, out of all those hundreds of thousands of men who are perfect, I should have married one of the perfect ones. That's what I'm trying to say. That doesn't exist. And I don't understand people with that mind frame. Maybe some of you guys could enlighten me if you do. But I don't understand the people who do that. That's one of my big things I don't understand about the could have, would have, should have illusion. They're acting like, man, if I could have went back 10 years to when I first decided to get married, why did I pick this person to marry when there's all of these dozens and dozens and dozens of awesome options that would have fit so well. And I'm sitting there looking at them like, that does not exist. Like, what world do you live in? That doesn't exist in the first place. I can understand being frustrated with someone that you're in a permanent relationship with and things like that. But what I don't understand is this could have, should have, would have illusion, to the point where you're assuming that there were hundreds, and this really gets into job options too, especially in these times. But people assuming that there were hundreds and hundreds of excellent, superior, excellent options that, to me, I've been around, I've seen, that doesn't exist. What world do you live in? And so this just goes back into having realistic expectations, realistic views of the world. Like, I would respect a woman more that would say, if I had it to do over and I went back 10 years ago when I first got married to this person, if I would have known that they were going to be so sloppy and disrespectful and so demanding of me, things that really are kind of not cool, especially when you're not doing it back, when you're really trying hard. But I could respect her more if she said, if I had it to do over and I knew he was going to be this difficult to live with, I would have just stayed single. I can respect that because that is reasonable. Or I would have spent a whole lot more time with him until I knew he was that way, and then I would have just stayed single until someone who obviously was not that way came along. What I can't understand with the coulda, shoulda, woulda illusion is there's hundreds and thousands of people out there that would have been way much better to marry, and it was super obvious, and I knew it this whole time. And this really, to me, also, like I say, the job situation is really getting into that category also of there's not hundreds and thousands of excellent options. There is a very big narcissistic abuse situation happening in the workforce, to where a lot of people are just being more quiet about it, or they're switching jobs more often, and so you don't really hear about it a lot. But I believe a lot of people are having a lot of stress at their job, or at least a lot of uncertainty, for the same reason that we don't have these hundreds and thousands of perfect options to choose from. It's just not there. So I don't understand the criticisms of, I should have. This is part of what I'm encouraging you guys. If you catch yourself beating yourself up over kicking yourself, or having other people try to get you to kick yourself, that you should have chosen a different career path, you should have made different investment options, you should have had better parenting choices, or that you should have had a different significant other, within reason, because there is obviously a very wrong path you can take, but within reason, when you really tried and were wise and careful and godly, there should not be a whole lot of kicking yourself, because we have to be realistic about the world that we're really in. So that's really all I'm going there with that one. And it reminds me, recently I saw this little YouTube video. YouTube has been doing this thing where they're doing a lot of things, and you probably may notice it on the narcissist channels, that some of the main channels even are changing their, just kind of shifting the way they're doing things, because there is a big hit that's going on against truth channels and against spiritual truth and reality channels, and against channels that are exposing narcissism. But I noticed, because I subscribe to a lot of news and spirituality and truth and spiritual teaching channels, that when I go into like my news feed to skim through to figure out, to try to find, something that I want to watch from my favorite channels, there will be tons and tons and tons of, and it may be a new marketing strategy of, these other kind of channels are paying money to get themselves in the news feed, and I'm not even subscribed to them. But there's all these channels that have all these people making things with paint, animals doing interesting things, people catching 100,000 matches on fire that they designed to look like a rocket ship. All of these videos that get millions of views are suddenly in my news feed, where I can never see what I actually want to see. And at first it was enough that I could go in there and click that I don't want to see that, and it would say, okay, I understand you don't want to see this. But now it's like almost every single video in my news feed is all these videos that I did not even subscribe to. But a lot of them are very interesting. I wonder if they're trying to catch your interest away from truth and away from reality into fun or something. But one of these videos that came into my news feed was these little monkeys, and they had put a very lifelike looking doll of a monkey that just laid there. They had put this little monkey into, like, on the ground, into the middle of the real monkeys, the monkey little tribe. And what was sad, they didn't expect this, but what was sad is they went up and they tried to pick the doll up and play with it. And I don't know how realistic they made the doll as far as the smell and if they put like real fur on it or something. But this group of little monkeys, once the doll did not move and did not respond, they put it like in the middle of their circle, and they all started grieving over the monkey as though it was dead, as though they had found a little baby dead monkey. And they were grieving, and they went through like their grieving process that they do, and they were hugging each other and comforting each other that the little monkey had died. And that was kind of sweet and heart-touching, but it was a perfect image of what I'm talking about, weeping for Tammuz. It never existed, and it never happened. And these creatures were having legit pain and grief and getting caught up into something that never existed and never happened. But they were creating a lie. It reminds me of the verse of the one who loves and makes a lie being judged at the end of their life, and how much of our lives will be spent up in these Tammuz idols where we love and create a lie that never existed and never happened, and we're allowing ourselves to be trained to do it, and we're wasting our life, we're having grief, we're being separated from God and the truth of God and the reality of God over things that never existed and never happened. Now, some of the things we can get caught up and distracted from God are real things, but I'm talking about the things that really just never existed, the idols, the illusions, the heartache, the grief, when it was never real. But there's so much freedom in recognizing that it was never real. After you go through the process of acceptance or grief of whatever you have to do, like I said, of the idea we have of grieving, that the person was never really a person that you thought they were somebody completely different. And there's different ways, obviously, we've talked about, to grieve that, such as recognizing that, at least your love was real. Your devotion. That's why from the beginning to the end, guys, as much a relationship you can have with God and doing it for God, the better. Because you can at least go back and say, well, the whole time was not a waste, because I worked as unto the Lord. I was giving all of that for good things in life and for God and for other people that I love, for my children, for my parents, and for my other family. But this idea of very powerful images, like the little baby doll monkey, very powerful images of it seems real enough, it seems legitimate enough that it becomes an archetype or a symbol or an image to our heart that is blind. The heart that is blind, because even those monkeys may have known that that was not a real monkey, but they could have just as easily had very strong feelings as though it was. And that's what I'm trying to get here, of the blind heart. When we don't know how to unlock those things and introduce truth in there enough, like having a relationship with Jesus and renewing our mind with the Word of God, that our heart will be caught up very quickly into something that's not even real, very strong symbols to our heart that we believe it. We believe it too much and we get imprisoned instead of free. I believe really only the power of God can remove or replace these things, and especially the times becoming so evil. It's going to be so powerful for us to know that we have eternity with God. This needs to be our focus as much as possible in the days that are coming, to be able to overcome, to be stronger than this, to be free, and to overcome the way that God means us to. We're going to have to learn really to have that right relationship with the Lord, to know His truths, and to learn how to process these things and get over them as quickly as we can, and to focus correctly. But this is just kind of trying to help people to not be in a bitterness trap. And the Bible speaks about the root of bitterness that defiles many people. This is probably why, is this heart issue, the illusions that life can give people. Everyone is going to struggle with these issues. Everybody. I believe the enemy is going to try to set these traps for everybody. It's going to be a bitterness trap for everybody. That's why so many people are defiled by it. But this will prevent you from beating yourself up over things, like I say, that never existed and never happened. Or having someone trick you into beating yourself up, like we discussed. From being angry, entitled, bitter, and thinking that things should have been different when they were never going to be. That's another thing. If you ever have something in your life that you're like, man, it just should have went so different. There is a degree of that that's legitimate. Like I have done a video recently on for things that went in my life, like a decade or more of my life wasted, so-called, which I've tried to redeem so much with the Lord, and I believe has been, but wasted in narcissistic abuse and lots of ways that kind of knocked me off of a lot of different paths in my life, kind of. But like I say, I have to keep in mind that time is so short, and the times that we're in, I believe that a lot of people are so-called being led off a normal life path, right? Losing our families early, feeling like we have, losing opportunities, losing life pathways way too early or often. And it can be so easy, especially in these times, of thinking, it should have been different. I should have been able to work a 9 to 5 from the time that I was 20 till I was 60, and then I should have been able to retire easily with lots of money and a house paid for, and the grandkids coming in, all this, and I should have been able to been with one wife and one husband all this time and blessed, and nobody should have had cancer. And we have this idea of like this American dream of this perfect way it should have been. Well, not only was it never that way, right? That's a sales tactic. This is back to this idea, guys, of breaking this illusion. Not only was it never going to perfectly be that way, but especially in the end times. Especially in the end times, man. It's more like in the end times, especially if you read the Word of God of what's coming next. It's more like prison, beatings, betrayals, things that you were unexpected in life changing, life rearranging, difficulties. And I don't say it flippantly. It's not a flippant thing, but I'm just trying to bring a reality check here that, okay, we feel like maybe we have been derailed because of narcissistic abuse, when really it was a preparation ground, and it was solidifying the right side that we're on spiritually, and a lot of other positive good things for the time we're in. It's like being realistic instead of being bitter of, oh, it should have been like that, it should have never happened. No, not really. When it's in Jesus' hands, it's going to be okay. It's a lot of these things that feel like they're derailed in the natural are actually in the supernatural. Like I said, we're laying up treasure in heaven. It's perfectly okay. Nothing was derailed. Nothing was stolen that will not be restored. And a lot of times this will be in the supernatural, but we are supposed to walk in the supernatural with God. So the difference between having the bitterness trap and getting caught up in anger that it should have been something else versus what it really is. What it really is, and it's okay. And it's a lot of other people going through it too, but they're just being quiet about it over either maturity or embarrassment or whatever. People don't share all the things all the time they go through. But this idea, this illusion that we can easily have of how life should have gone, versus especially now in these days, if you guys just look at the world and look at the weather and look at the news, you'll realize it was never going to be the American dream. That does not exist, especially not now. But a lot of people have been disillusioned with this American dream, this Hollywood sales. Every time you turn on the television, as far as fantasy, TV shows, one more reason to cut it out of your life, there's going to be a whole lot of people on there that have a lot of stuff together and things are working well, and it gives you the ideal. It gives you the perfect ideal. The houses are clean. The clothes are perfect. Everything's perfect to a level that I can't even describe, to where people develop these expectations that if it's not like that, that's where a lot of people end up spending lots of money and different things. But if it's not like it is on TV, if my family doesn't look like that, if my house doesn't look like that, I'm somehow inadequate. And some people just will beat themselves up, and other people will get bitter or angry or arrogant or entitled. Lots of different traps there. So this video is about trying to help people overcome the traps and overcome. This is one more thing of the world that the Christian is supposed to overcome, is meant to overcome. You can also have the trap of grieving and pining because you thought you lost something when really that something never existed. Like I say, it never existed, it never happened, or like I've been trying to say, it was never going to. It was never going to be like that, most likely, because a lot of times we have this problem, and some people call it splitting, where we turn something into either perfectly good or perfectly evil. It was going to be perfectly ideal or perfectly ruined, and this catches a whole lot of people up. We probably all fall into this one time or another in our life, but not realizing, like, man, it should have been so much like this. Not realizing that even at the best, it was never going to be like that. It was never going to be. Some parts might have even been even better, but a lot of parts were not. But a lot of parts were probably going to be worse. So that's another trick I see people getting into. Anytime there's the idealistic, the idealized, the perfect, the extreme black or the extreme white, and which really can easily become an idol. This is what some people call the grass being greener concept. But we really just need the freedom of the truth. And of course, wonderfully for the Christian, we always have Jesus. The true close reality to him is the perfect freedom. But there's also other ins and outs and nuances of the truth that can really help us. And really the words of God give us that. Good teaching and good concepts that really only come from the Lord can give us that. A lot of times it can be even a process to forgive yourself for things you have went through and for seasons you have went through of being illusioned, of thinking that something was something that it wasn't. It can take a while to process what we felt like was wasted time that we wish would have been spent different ways. Anger because we were lied to, perhaps. Anger that we weren't able to see the truth or know the truth, or were told things that weren't the truth. And all this is understandable. This is part of what I put into forgiveness, a forgiveness process of time that we feel was wasted, caught up, or led astray. And so it's not all going to be like perfectly redeemable all the time. We will go through some grief and some forgiveness and some processing of, I didn't see it correctly. I wasn't responding correctly. I really did believe the lie. It really did lead my heart astray. And I really was caught up in feelings and emotions over things that never happened and never existed. Because sometimes it's not as clear as a Star Wars movie. Like, we can look on the movie screen and we can logically just go, that's just, it was a story. It's a childish story that never happened, and walk away. Some people never even get caught up in it because Star Wars is not their thing, is how they put it, And so if only every time a falsehood came in and tried to capture our heart that can't see, that we could just walk away from it that easy and be like, psh, that never happened, never existed. We have to somehow process and get over what we felt was so real. Like people say, grieving who you thought someone was instead of who they really were. Grieving the loss of who you thought the abuser was, that kind of thing. So there's always that to go through also. And it is normal to a degree to get caught up because we don't have perfect vision and we don't see things perfectly, and sometimes we're told straight lies. And the thing is, we have to give it to God, and God can really help us process through this and refocus way completely different, give us a completely different perspective, shortcut our grief processes, and to go forward with a lot of hope. Like going forward, finding a lot of good, peaceful hope and purpose that will be very individual. And that can give you something to really go forward with, despite any losses. But especially in the times that are going to be so difficult of the people of God being worn out and worn down. And this is really about, we really do not need to even have, and God is really going to bless people that He sees trying to cut these influences off. We don't need the distractions anymore. We don't need the TVs. We don't need the music. We don't need the movies anymore. We don't need the soap operas. We don't need the Star Warses and the Star Treks and the movies. We don't need an iota of the illusions around us. We need to make very clear steps, whatever that is between you and God. These very clear commitments between you and God that shows God so you can have more of His help in like a commitment and an agreement of you're not going to weep for Tammuz. You're not even going to look at Tammuz. You're not going to care about Tammuz. That's for the pagans. And you need God's help going forward to do all of this overcoming that He's talking about in Revelation of the end times, the end time believers. And this is a study that I really want to get into more, that I've talked about on another video of Lynn Leah's channel did a really good video of how long, and she's talking about, from her perspective, the saints that we read about in the Bible to her that went through some tremendous persecution. She recognizes what she is calling, they had something that we don't have anymore. And that's kind of what I'm touching on here. And part of what we don't have anymore is things like this. We don't even have the teachings of this, and when you try to teach it, you're being legalistic and you're going too far. But especially going into the times we're going into and what we're going to be called to and what we're going to need to have, and really needing to fill our lamps full of oil, we don't need to be caught in bitterness traps and all these distractions and being entitled over things that never existed and never happened and was never going to. Not exactly in the idolatrous way that our heart can make us believe that it would. And not to mention the constant worldly and distractions and entertainments of, she's asking, I love the way she put it too, that we need to be seeking. She said we need to be digging like for lost treasure of what is it that we no longer see that these people in the Bible used to have. And I would argue in other places in the world they still have it, where there has been persecution for a while, or that the spiritual atmosphere is different. And I only say that because I thought we lost it like decades ago, several decades ago, and a lot of people have been saying that we've lost a lot of those things, and I've been so criticized for saying that as though I'm personally attacking people, but I'm not. It's something that I have spiritually, personally experienced, and what she's talking about too, of something we have lost. And I know that it's just as true and as real as anything I've ever experienced, that I keep mentioning this conference I went to in 2013. A lot of what I'm saying we lost was at that conference. It was there. I felt it in the spirit. I knew I was not imagining it. What I didn't know is that it was still available on earth today. I suspected it was available in other countries. But other countries who worship and experience things differently, with like a lot less Babylonianism, a lot less worship of idols in the land and all this, and maybe bloodshed from abortions and all this. But whatever was going on at that conference, I'm like, ooh, we have not lost it. This is verbatim what I have been talking about. Not only that, but I've coached myself, don't leave here and start looking for it everywhere, because you're not going to find it. You're just going to waste your time. But all that being said, I think this is some of the keys that we're being led to and called to, of we're going into completely different times. These are things we can't afford. We can't afford them anyway, but especially where we're going, where we're really going to be called on for some things and having to overcome, this is where we start cutting these weights off. And the bitterness, the arrogance, the entitlement, the separation from God, the not having the close relationship with God, the illusions, the heart that's trained to believe illusions, the weeping for Tammuz, the believing the idols, the constantly being emotionally led by the nose from idol to idol to idol that's vain and leading to nowhere, that never happened, never existed, and was never going to. And complete opposite of overcoming, completely the direct opposite. Illusions never happened, never existed, and was never going to. And the truth makes you free. That's the thing. The truth makes you free. You don't have to be led by the nose. You don't have to be a captive. You don't have to weep for Tammuz. You don't have to mourn and grieve endlessly in a cycle that never comes to a closure, that never comes to peace, that never goes forward with God. But always, guys, be on the lookout for the ways you're being programmed to be weak in this way, to be captivated, to be dumbed down, to be hopeless. And a lot of times the trickery, though, is just being entertained. You're looking to be entertained, or you're looking to scratch the itch or fulfill the flesh instead of crucifying or circumcising it. And habits, things you've been taught wrong, or having a deeper commitment with God where He's going to reward you on your journey to get away from Tammuz and not pay Tammuz any homage at all, because you're not entertaining the idols or the devil or the entertainment or the fantasy in any way. That's a big part of it. It never existed, it never happened, and it was never going to. There's a lot of illusions, but it's okay that your heart is blind, because everyone's heart is blind. But it's not okay to say, I'm not going to give that to the Lord. I'm not going to let the Lord in. I'm not going to know His ways. I'm not going to even care. I'm going to keep weeping for Tammuz because I love Tammuz. And I'm so sad for him, and I lust after the process, and I'm trapped in lust, and I'm super angry, bitter, entitled, arrogant, and selfish, and I'm stubborn, and I'm not going to let Jesus in. On the down low, I don't really even like Jesus, because I'm not going to let Him in my heart to change this, and I don't really care about having a close relationship or knowing Him or taking Him with me anywhere. And I'd rather have the illusion because it's comfortable, or it's fun, or I wish it happened. All this stuff is not the way to be, obviously. But what's really cool is that even though some of these things that we were tricked into maybe couldn't see before, even though they never existed and they never happened, what's really cool is, thankfully, much better always did. That's what's really hard too, is when you're emotionally caught up into a grief process, guys, that if you only would have just known something about the process, you would be like, that's not so sad after all. That's another tricky thing in my brain that I had to go through with my process of healing in my abuse situation, is I had to come to a point where I was like, it's okay. It happens. It's a real thing that happens with people, that they go down an entire emotional pathway that was unnecessary. It didn't really have to happen. If they only would have had different kind of knowledge, they could have been on a completely different emotional pathway, because those pathways can become so real to us. It can be hard sometimes to shift our brain into knowing what was real and what wasn't. Like, oh well, this was real, but this wasn't. All this time it could have been different. And part of your retraining your heart, or whatever you have to do there, is becoming okay with, you spent 3, 4, 5 years or decades or whatever it was having all of these feelings that somehow or other was not aligned with reality in important ways, where you could have been on a whole different path. Or, now a lot of people would argue, well, that was your truth and that was valuable, so take value in it. But I would say that only goes so far, because where God wants His children is in freedom. God wants His children in freedom. The truth will make you free. But that part of the truth can even be hard to process, to say, what part of that wasn't real, so that I can be thinking the way that I should have been thinking all that time. That's another part that can be hard too, in overcoming, in processing. But what's usually true is, it never existed, it never happened, but thankfully much better always existed. Much better was always happening with God. And that's where we're going to go forward, is with God, where He has the truth that makes us free. So I think that's all I have for these illusions and weeping for Tammuz. I hope this was helpful. If you have any other helpful comments you feel like would help other people, please leave them below. This is an important thing that has to do with the heart issues, and getting past and getting over things that we're being tricked about, and overcoming in these times. It's so important. So please leave any tips, advice, or encouragement that can help us in this process. I hope you guys all stay safe out there. I hope to see you soon on my next video.